The dust on Larkspur Ridge Road had a way of rising before anything arrived. That evening, it lifted in a pale brown veil around Rowan Hale's boots as he stood beside his idling truck, one hand still resting on the open driver's door, the other holding a coil of fence wire he had forgotten to set down. The sun had dropped behind the low Montana hills, leaving the gravel warm in patches and cool in the shadows. Crickets had started up in the ditch grass. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark gave one last note and went quiet. Then Rowan saw the bobcat. She was crouched near the mouth of the old culvert, half hidden by rabbit brush and dust, her body low, her ears flattened, one foreleg tucked as if she did not trust the ground beneath it. She did not cry out. Wild things rarely did when fear had already used up their strength. She only watched him with yellow eyes that caught the last light like two pieces of creek stone under water. Rowan did not move. He had lived alone long enough to know that sudden kindness could look like danger from the other side. A few yards behind her, near the ditch where the road bent toward the pine brake, another shape slipped between the weeds. Then another. Rowan's breath changed before his mind understood what he was seeing. The first bobcat was not alone. In the unsettled dust beyond her, 5 smaller forms held still as shadows, thin-backed and silent, their rounded ears just visible above the tawny grass. He had come down the road to repair a broken fence. He had found a whole secret waiting for him. If this quiet beginning finds a place in the heart, viewers may gently like and subscribe, and leave a comment with where they are watching from and the name of an animal that once changed their life. Stories like this seem to travel better when carried softly from one person to another. Rowan eased the truck door shut without letting it click. The bobcat's whiskers twitched. Her nose lifted once, testing him through the smell of warm engine metal, dry weeds, and the faint trace of leather gloves hanging from his back pocket. She was young, not a kitten, not fully heavy with age either, with a narrow face and a pale muzzle that made her look older than her body. Her right ear had a clean crescent notch missing from the rim, as if the moon had taken a small bite and left her marked. The 5 behind her did not come closer. They shifted in little broken movements. One paw, then stillness, one shoulder through grass, then stillness again. Bobcats were made of caution. Even hungry ones knew how to vanish inside an ordinary evening. Rowan had seen plenty of them in his 58 years, mostly as brief surprises at the edge of a pasture or a pair of eyes floating beyond the barn light. They belonged to the ridge the way junipers did, quiet and sharp and not asking permission. He respected that. His late wife, Clara, had once said that the best neighbors in the world were the ones who did not knock unless they had to. This one had not knocked. She had placed herself in the road. Rowan lowered the coil of wire into the truck bed so slowly that it made almost no sound. Still, one of the smaller bobcats flattened its body until it looked like a stripe of dust. Another turned its head and showed a flash of pale chin. The injured female did not look away from Rowan. Her tail, short and dark-tipped, gave a single stiff flick against the gravel. "Easy," Rowan said, though the word was no bigger than a breath. He did not step toward her. He looked at the space beside her, instead of staring straight into her eyes. Clara had taught him that with frightened horses years ago, back when the barn still smelled of sweet hay and there had been 2 coffee mugs in the sink every morning instead of 1 chipped blue one. Thinking of Clara came unexpectedly, like touching a bruise through a shirt. She would have known what to do first, or maybe she would have pretended she did, which had often been close enough. She would have told him to quit standing there, vacep ite, hat his mouth open, and fetch water. She would have frowned at the limp, softened at the kittens, and then reminded him twice that wild meant wild, no matter how small the faces looked in the grass. Rowan swallowed and turned his head toward the back of the truck. There was an old enamel pie pan wedged beside a toolbox, one he used for loose nails. He emptied the nails into a coffee can, wiped the pan with the corner of his shirt, and took a gallon jug of water from behind the seat. The plastic had gone warm from the cab, but it was clean. He poured slowly, listening to the thin glug of water, the tiny splash against enamel, the soft hiss of gravel under his shifting boot. The bobcat watched every movement. One of the 5 sneezed. It was such a small, dusty sound that Rowan almost smiled despite himself. The sneezer backed into a weed stem, as if offended by its own nose. Another little one blinked twice, solemn and round-eyed, then disappeared entirely behind a clump of grass too narrow to hide anything properly. Rowan found himself thinking that fear did not always know how visible it was. He set the pan down in the road. Not near the bobcat. Not near the culvert. A good 12 feet away, where she could choose it without choosing him. Then he stepped back to the truck and waited. The evening deepened around them. A faint orange line held along the hills. The gravel road, usually empty except for cattle trucks and the mail lady Elle's white Jeep, seemed to be holding its breath. Rowan could hear his own old truck ticking as the engine cooled. He could hear a grasshopper clicking in the ditch. He could hear, with painful clarity, the hollow place inside his house waiting for him at the top of the ridge. He had not expected anything to need him again. That was the thought that came and sat beside him, heavier than the coil of wire, heavier than the tools in the truck bed. Since Clara had passed 2 winters earlier, Rowan had become useful in pieces. He fixed gates. He patched fences. He delivered extra eggs to his neighbor Ruth Bell when his hens laid more than one man could eat. But being useful was not the same as being needed. Need had a different sound. It pulled a man forward even when he was afraid of what it might cost. The bobcat lifted herself. Only a little. Her injured foreleg hovered, then touched down carefully. She was favoring one side, but she had pride left in every inch of her. She did not stagger toward the water. She angled. She paused. She listened to the ditch. She looked past Rowan, not at him, as though checking whether he had brought trouble hiding behind his shoulder. The 5 smaller shapes stirred behind her. Rowan's fingers tightened around the truck door handle. He wanted to help. That want rose in him too quickly, too clumsily. He knew better than to walk into the middle of wild hunger and fear with a human plan and expect gratitude. So he stayed where he was. The bobcat reached the pan. She bent her head without taking her eyes completely off him and drank 3 quick laps. Then she stopped, lifted her chin, and let one clear drop fall from her whiskers into the dust. For some reason, that small drop nearly undid him. Not the limp, not the 5 hidden bodies, not the way the evening had changed shape around him. Just that one drop of water falling from a wild creature's chin onto a road he had driven 1,000 lonely times. Behind her, the smallest of the 5 crept forward half a step. The injured female turned her head sharply. The little one froze, ears wide, front paw suspended in air. Rowan's mouth curved before he could stop it. The youngster looked exactly like a child caught reaching for pie before supper. A second kitten pressed its nose into the first one's flank, then recoiled as if surprised that another body had been there. The third sat down in the dust with grave importance, too dignified for its own thin legs. Warmth moved through Rowan, careful and unfamiliar. The female drank again, longer this time. He noticed the crescent notch in her ear more clearly now. He noticed burrs caught along her side, dust clinging to the pale fur beneath her chin, and the way she cocky-pate her body between him and the five in the ditch. Hurt or not, afraid or not, she had placed herself as the narrow wall between danger and what followed her. Rowan understood that better than he wanted to. He had stood that way once beside Clara's hospital bed, when the doctors spoke in quiet voices, and the world seemed to narrow to a door he could not hold shut. He had stood between hope and loss, with nothing in his hands, pretending his presence could change the weather. The Bobcat finished drinking and backed away from the pan. She did not know her back. She retreated step by careful step until the grass touched her shoulders. The five small ones melted around her, appearing and disappearing in the roadside weeds, like pieces of the same thought. Rowan did not follow. He only reached into the cab for his phone and called the one person he trusted with wild trouble. Ranger Mara Ellis answered on the fourth ring, her voice rough with wind and distance. "Mara," he said quietly, watching the dust settle where the Bobcat had stood. "Mort think Mort V got something down on Larkspur Road." There was a pause. How bad? Rowan looked at the ditch, at the crescent-notched ear just visible in the grass, at the five smaller shadows waiting behind her as if the whole ridge had gathered itself into one trembling family. "Not bad yet," he said, "but close." Before that evening on the gravel road, Rowan Hale's life had become a quiet arrangement of chores. He rose before sunrise because his body still believed there were two people in the house, and one of them needed coffee, ready before the other came downstairs. The habit had outlived Clara by almost 2 years. Some mornings he would fill the kettle, set 2 mugs beside the stove, then notice the blue one and the white one sitting together like a mistake made by memory. He always put the white one back. He always drank from the chipped blue mug, the one with a hairline crack near the handle that Clara had once said made it too stubborn to throw away. The kitchen smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the dry dust that crept in no matter how often he swept. Outside, the ridge woke slowly. Fence posts leaned in long shadows. The hens complained before the sun cleared the cottonwoods, sounding personally insulted that breakfast did not appear the moment they thought of it. Rowan fed them from an old coffee can, and one speckled hen named Dottie followed him, with the grave suspicion of a sheriff. He often told her, "You already ate." Dottie never believed him. His place sat 8 miles from the nearest paved road, at the high end of Larkspur Ridge, where the grass went silver in late summer and the pine brakes held their cool breath even at noon. The house had been built by his father, added on to by Rowan, softened by Clara, and then left oddly large when illness carried her away. There was a narrow porch with one broken step he kept meaning to fix, a barn that smelled of hay and old rain, and a workshed vey kept to hat tools hanging in the exact crooked order only he understood. Rowan repaired fences for ranchers, widows, hobby farmers, and stubborn men too proud to admit their knees had gone bad. He drove a faded green truck with a dent near the passenger door where a loose gate had swung into it during a storm. In the bed he kept wire cutters, leather gloves, fence staples, cedar stays, a thermos, a rope come along, and a folded blue towel Clara had once used to wrap jars of peach jam so they would not clink on the ride to church. He never took the towel out. It had become part of the truck, like the rust along the wheel well. People in the county liked Rowan because he arrived when he said he would and did not talk more than a job required. Ruth Bell, who lived down the road with 2 goats and a porch full of geraniums, sometimes sent him home with biscuits wrapped in foil. She wrote little notes on the packets as if he were a schoolboy. "Eat these warm," Don to argue. Once, she had left a jar of chokecherry jelly on his seat, with a label that read "for emotional emergencies." Rowan had laughed alone in the truck for the first time in weeks, then eaten half of it with a spoon that evening because there had been no one there to stop him. That was how his loneliness mostly lived. Not dramatic. Not loud. It sat in ordinary places. Across the table. Beside the washing machine where Clara's gardening gloves still hung. In the silence after he said something mildly funny and no answer came back. He had a daughter, Elise, in Bozeman, 41 years old, and kind in the careful way adult children became when they worried their parents might break if pressed too hard. She called every Sunday evening. She asked whether he was eating. He told her yes, which was mostly true. She asked whether he had thought any more about selling the Ridge place and moving closer. He told her the hens would hate city life. She would sigh, then laugh softly, because she knew he had hidden the real answer inside the joke. The real answer was that he did not know who he would be anywhere else. On the Ridge, grief had borders. The fence line, the cottonwood draw, the porch where Clara had shelled peas in a tin bowl, the small garden where her rosemary bush still survived. Winters it had no business surviving. Leaving felt less like moving than abandoning the last language they had spoken together. So Rowan stayed. He fixed what broke. He patched what sagged. He ate supper at the same square table, usually beans or eggs or whatever Ruth had bullied into his hands. He listened to the radio until the voices became too cheerful, then turned it off and let the house settle around him. Wildlife moved around the edges of his days as it always had. Mule deer came down at dusk and stood beyond the fence like shy guests. A porcupine once waddled through the yard with the slow confidence of a retired judge. Raccoons raided the feed shed latch until Rowan replaced it with one that required more patience than they possessed, though one low apt, muddy handprints on the door as if filing a complaint. Bobcats were different. They rarely made themselves known. Sometimes he found their tracks in the dust near the dry creek, round and neat, with no claw marks showing. Sometimes a patch of flattened grass beneath a juniper told him one had rested there, invisible even after it had gone. Once, in winter, he had seen a bobcat cross a snowy pasture at dawn, not running, not hurrying, simply placing each paw as if the whole white world belonged to its silence. Clara had loved that sight. "Nothing wastes emotion when it's wild," she had whispered. Rowan remembered that often. After she died, he found himself watching the tree line more than he used to. He told himself he was checking for downed limbs, cattle breaks, storm damage, but sometimes he knew he was only waiting to see something alive move with purpose, something that did not need permission to exist, something that had not learned to apologize for surviving. He had not become bitter, exactly. He still waved at passing trucks. He still fixed Ruth's gate for free and pretended to overcharge her so she could pretend to scold him. He still brought Elise a box of apples every fall and let his grandson Caleb climb into the truck cab to honk the horn once, only once, because the boy believed rules were stronger when they had ceremony. There were soft things left in him. They had just grown quiet. That was why, when Ranger Mara Ellis answered his call on Larkspur Road, she knew not to dismiss the weight in his voice. She had known Rowan for 12 years, through wildfire seasons, injured hawks, stranded calves, and one memorable afternoon when he helped coax a young black bear out of Ruth's pantry while Ruth stood outside holding a broom she had no realistic plan for using. Mara trusted Rowan because he did not dramatize trouble. If he said something was close to bad, it was already standing at the edge. While he waited for her headlights, Rowan leaned against his truck and looked toward the ditch where the notched ear bobcat had vanished. The water pan sat in the road, dented and shining faintly in the last of the light. Once, grass stirred near it, low and careful. A small muzzle appeared, sniffed the rim, then withdrew so fast Rowan might have imagined it. The injured female remained hidden, but he felt her there the way a man felt weather behind his shoulder. He thought of the second mug in the cupboard. He thought of Clara saying wild meant wild. Then he reached into the truck bed, found the blue towel, and folded it once across his arm, without knowing yet why he needed it. Mara Ellis arrived after the light had nearly gone out of the road. Her state truck came slowly around the bend, tires whispering over gravel instead of crunching, as if she already knew the evening could not bear much noise. She killed the engine 30 yards back and let the headlights fade to amber parking lamps. In that softer glow, the dust looked like old smoke hanging low over the ditch grass. Rowan lifted one hand. Mara stepped out with a canvas field bag over her shoulder, her braid tucked beneath a ranger cap, her boots already dusty to the ankle. She was 46, narrow-eyed from years of looking across bright country, and calm in the way of people who had learned that panic used up the strength better saved for careful work. "Show me," she said. Rowan pointed without extending his arm too sharply. Culvert mouth. Female. Mort think. Young. Limping on the front. 5 smaller ones behind her. Mara's face changed only a little, but Rowan saw it. A tightening near the mouth. A slight stillness in her shoulders. 5? That S what Mott counted. Could be this year's young, Mara said quietly. Could be siblings pulled from somewhere else. Could be she-s the only adult left they trust. Rowan looked toward the weeds. The old culvert ran beneath the gravel road where spring runoff crossed from the cedar slope to the dry creek bed. By late summer, it held only damp shadows, mouse tracks, and the mineral smell of wet stone. Rabbit brush crowded one side. A patch of prickly pear guarded the other. If a hurt animal wanted a place to become invisible, it could not have chosen better. Mara crouched beside the water pan first. She did not touch it. She only looked at the dust around it, then at the faint paw marks near the rim. She drank. 3 times, Rowan said. Maybe more after Mort looked away. Mara glanced at him. You looked away? Seemed polite. For the first time that night, her mouth softened. That might be the most Rowan Hale answer you've ever given me. The warmth of it eased something in him. Not much, but enough. They stood listening. A small stone clicked inside the culvert. Mara raised one hand, and both of them froze. From the dark round mouth beneath the road, 2 eyes appeared low to the ground. Then the young female eased forward just far enough for the amber truck light to find her face. Her crescent-notched ear showed clear against the shadow. Dust clung to the pale fur below her chin. Her whiskers were uneven on one side, with one long white whisker bent at a strange angle like a kinked piece of wire. Rowan's eyes fixed on that bent whisker. It made her seem less like a sighting and more like a life. She drew her lips back, not in a full snarl, but in warning. Her body stayed low, shoulders bunched, injured foreleg hovering. Behind her, 5 smaller shapes crowded the deeper dark, pressing close without quite touching. One tried to peer around her and received a sharp sideways nudge from her hip. The little one folded itself back into place. Mara breathed out slowly. There she is. She's been keeping herself between them and me. Good mothering, or good guarding. Either way, she's working hard. Rowan did not answer. The word mothering moved through him with a quiet ache, though he knew better than to attach a human shape too quickly to what he did not understand. Still, the female S position was plain. Hurt, hungry, Frightened, she had made a door of her own body. Mara eased her field bag down and opened it inch by inch. The zipper sounded too loud. The Bobcat's ears flattened. Rowan felt his hand lift slightly, uselessly, as if he could smooth the sound out of the air. "Sorry," Mara whispered, though whether to Rowan or the Bobcat, he could not tell. She took out binoculars, a small flashlight with a red lens, and a folded towel darker and cleaner than Rowan's blue one. She did not bring out a net. She did not bring out a cage. Rowan noticed that and was grateful, without knowing how to say it. "She's too alert to trap tonight unless she declines," Mara said. "If we rush her, she may bolt and take the young ones with her. We need to see if she can move, if she'll drink, maybe if she look take food. Then we make a plan." Rowan nodded. Moat V got a little chicken in the cooler. For lunch tomorrow. Ruth sent it. "Ruth Bell sent you chicken for tomorrow?" She said she didn't trust my understanding of vegetables. Mara gave a tiny laugh through her nose. She's not wrong. The Bobcat's eyes flicked at the sound. Both humans went quiet again. Rowan walked back to the truck slowly and opened the cooler. The cold smell of wrapped chicken rose with melting ice and wax paper. Ruth had tucked in a biscuit too, because Ruth believed every container deserved a biscuit. Rowan almost smiled when he saw it lying there, round and floury, completely unsuited to wildlife emergency, but deeply suited to Ruth. He tore a small piece of chicken, then stopped and looked at Mara. Too close. Set it past the pan. Then back up farther than you think you need to. He did exactly that. The gravel pressed through the soles of his boots as he moved. A mosquito whined near his ear. The evening had cooled enough that the dry weeds gave off a bitter green smell when his pant leg brushed them. He placed the chicken on a flat stone beside the water, not in the pan, not near the culvert, then retreated until Mara lifted her palm to say enough. The Bobcat did not move for a long while. The five behind her shifted in small ripples. One made a faint churring sound, barely more than breath. The female turned her head and answered with a low rasp that stilled them all. It was not a sweet sound. It was not a tame sound. It carried warning, command, exhaustion, and something like fierce patience. Rowan felt humbled by it. He had spent 2 years thinking silence meant emptiness. Now here was silence crowded with life. Every blade of grass holding a possible movement, every shadow containing a decision. At last, the notched ear female stepped out. Her injured leg touched down, lifted quickly, touched again. She reached the chicken, smelled it, then looked straight past Rowan's shoulder, as if refusing to grant him credit. She took the piece in her teeth and backed away without eating until she was nearly inside the culvert again. Then she swallowed. One of the little ones edged forward, too eager, and stumbled over its own front paws. Another swatted softly at its tail, missed, and looked offended by the world. The smallest climbed over a sibling's back and slid down like a sack of grain. Rowan's chest warmed despite the worry sitting in it. Mara watched with her binoculars. "Thin," she murmured. "All of them. But bright-eyed. That's something." The female reappeared for a second piece. This time, she came 3 steps farther from the culvert before retreating. Her bent whisker trembled when she sniffed. The crescent notch in her ear caught the parking light. Rowan decided, without speaking it, that the notch made her look like she had survived an argument with the moon and walked away unimpressed. "What do we call her in the notes?" Mara asked. Rowan looked at the juniper shadows beyond the ditch, dark and patient against the ridge. Juniper, he said. Mara wrote it down. The bobcat lifted her head at the scratch of pencil on paper, and for one brief second, Rowan imagined she had heard the name and chosen not to object. Mara would not let Rowan pretend that kindness was simple. Before she left Larkspur Road, she walked him through every rule twice, her flashlight turned toward the gravel instead of the culvert. No touching, no cornering, no trying to lure Juniper into the house or barn, no feeding by hand. If the young ones stayed near, he was to give them distance, call before helping, and remember that a frightened bobcat with a hurt leg was still stronger than comfort. Rowan listened with his hat in both hands. Motka no ove kep, he said. Mara looked at him a moment longer than usual. Moat know you know, but grief makes people reach. The words settled between them with the smell of dust and warm truck tires. Rowan looked toward the culvert, where Juniper's notched ear barely showed among the rabbit brush. The 5 young ones had gone still behind her, tucked into shadow. He thought of all the times since Clara's death when he had reached for things that could not reach back. The second mug, the garden gate, the sleeve of her old work coat. I won tea grab at her, he said. Mara nodded. Then you might be able to help. That was how the first quiet bargain began. The next morning, Rowan returned before full sun with the old enamel pan, a second shallow dish, and a cooler packed under Mara's direction. The air smelled of sage and damp mineral breath from the culvert stones. Dew clung to the grass in silver beads. His boots darkened where they brushed it. He parked farther away than before. Juniper was not visible, but he felt watched. He had begun to understand that watched was not the same as welcomed. It was only the first thin thread across a distance. He placed water near the flat stone and a small portion of food 3 feet beyond it, closer to the culvert than to himself. Then he stepped back to the truck, leaned against the fender, and pretended to study a broken fence rail across the road. Pretending not to care became the hardest work of the morning. For 15 minutes, nothing moved. Then grass parted. Juniper emerged low and silent, her pale muzzle dusted ve kep ite hat burr fluff, her injured foreleg stiff but usable. She did not go straight to the food. She circled, stopping twice to scent the gravel, once to look up at a raven croaking from a fence post. Her short tail twitched at the bird as if she found its commentary unnecessary. Rowan whispered, "Mo'd agree with her." The raven fluffed itself, offended. Juniper drank first. Only then did she pick up the food and carry it back toward the culvert. One small bobcat face appeared behind her, then vanished when Juniper gave a low throat sound. Rowan admired the discipline of it. Even hungry, she made them wait. He came again at dusk, and the next morning, and the next. Each visit was almost the same, except no visit was ever the same to Rowan. Juniper taught him that patience had details. On the second day, she waited until he turned his shoulder before moving. On the third, she drank while he stood in view, though her eyes stayed hard and bright. On the fourth, she sat on the far side of the pan and washed one forepaw with 3 quick strokes, as if his presence was irritating but not worth leaving over. Rowan took that as a compliment and told no one except Dottie the hen, who responded by stepping into his boot print and scratching dust over it. At home, the Ridge place rearranged itself around the schedule of a wild animal. Rowan boiled coffee earlier. He packed the cooler with more care than he packed his own lunch. He wrote Mara's instructions on the back of an old feed receipt and pinned it beside the kitchen calendar. He told Ruth Bell only enough when she noticed the cooler. Injured bobcat, young ones nearby, ranger involved, no visiting, no pictures. Ruth sobered at Moat once and promised. Later, she sent him home with boiled chicken in a jar labeled "Not for you." The gravel clicked under his tires in a rhythm that soon became familiar to Juniper. By the end of the first week, she appeared before he opened the door, not close, never close, but visible. She waited near the culvert mouth with her head turned slightly sideways, the bent white whisker catching light whenever she sniffed. Rowan began using the same low whistle each time he arrived, 2 soft notes falling at the end. It had once called Clara's old barn cat from rafters and hayloft corners, though that cat had only obeyed when obedience suited him. The sound felt strange in Rowan's mouth, too full of old kitchen mornings, and Clara saying the cat had better timing than he did. Juniper did not come to the whistle. She did something more honest. She stopped leaving when she heard it. That small mercy entered Rowan quietly. He did not name it hope. Hope was a word that could spook a man if spoken too soon. But on the evening she remained in sight while he poured water, he felt a warmth open in him, like a window cracked after a long winter. The 5 young ones became brief punctuation marks in the grass, a spotted shoulder, a small paw on stone, one round face with a seed head stuck between its ears. Once, a bold youngster batted at the enamel pan after Juniper emptied it, startled itself with the ringing sound, and bounded backward into a sibling. The weeds trembled with offended silence. Rowan turned his face toward the truck so his smile would not look like staring. 3 feet became the measure of everything. The water sat 3 feet from the place Juniper tolerated. The food sat 3 feet from the water. Rowan stood 3 steps farther back than instinct told him. He learned to make himself ordinary, hat brim low, hands visible, breathing slow, no expectation placed on her wild shoulders. One evening, she limped to the pan, drank, and did not retreat right away. She looked at him across the cooling gravel. The sunset touched the crescent notch in her ear, and the dry grass whispered around the hidden young ones. Rowan held still. Juniper lowered her head, not in surrender, not in affection, but in acceptance of that one moment exactly as it was. It was enough. For a man living among things that were gone, enough felt almost impossible. The first unhidden meal happened on a Tuesday morning after a night of rain. It had not been enough rain to green the ridge, only enough to darken the dust and make the gravel smell sharp, like wet stone split open. Rowan drove down Larkspur Road with the windows cracked, listening to drops strike the running boards in small taps. Pale sunlight moved along the fence wire. He parked in the usual place. Before he stepped out, he saw Juniper. She was sitting beside the culvert, not tucked inside it, not half lost in the weeds, but visible in the open, damp gravel. Her crescent-notched ear tilted toward the truck. Her bent white whisker shone with rain. One forepaw rested lightly on the ground, still guarded, but no longer held tight against her chest. Rowan sat without touching the door handle. The sight felt too delicate for movement. For 9 mornings, he had come with water and food, and for 9 mornings, Juniper had eaten behind grass, culvert shadow, heat, and the slanted privacy of her own body. Even when her eyes allowed him to remain, her hunger had stayed hidden. Now she waited where he could see her. The cab smelled of coffee, damp canvas, and the biscuit Ruth had wrapped in a napkin with a note that read for the human, unless the Bobcat files paperwork. Rowan had laughed when he found it, then looked toward the passenger seat, as if Clara might have heard. He took the cooler and stepped down. Juniper did not run. The 5 young ones were nowhere at first. Then one small face appeared in the culvert mouth, ears too large for its narrow head. Another crouched behind a stone, its spotted back trembling with stillness. A third had climbed onto a low root and sat there like a poorly balanced ornament. Rowan pretended not to notice. He gave the low 2-note whistle. Juniper's ears turned. That was all. But it was no small thing. He poured fresh water into the enamel pan. The sound rang bright in the cool morning. He placed food on the flat stone and stepped back near the leaning fence post. The grass soaked the cuffs of his jeans. Juniper rose. She came forward slowly, each step chosen. Her injured leg still made her gait uneven, but there was more strength in her shoulder. She stopped once to smell the air. She looked at Rowan, then at the food, then at Rowan again, as if reminding him that tolerance was not friendship, and breakfast was not a contract. "Mort understand," he murmured. She lowered her head and ate. Not grabbed. Not carried away. Ate. Right there in the open, while Rowan stood kept eat a hat rainwater, seeping into his socks and his heart behaving like something younger than the rest of him. Juniper's jaw worked in small, efficient movements. Her ears continued to turn, catching sounds he could not hear. Every few bites she paused and looked toward the culvert where the young ones waited in a silence, held together by hunger and discipline. One of them chirred softly. Juniper did not move back. She gave a low, brief sound through her nose. The little one quieted, then sat down so abruptly that its hind legs slid in the mud. Its siblings stared emote the accident with deep concern. The third on the root tried to scratch behind one ear and nearly tipped off, recovering with such offended dignity that Rowan had to look at the wet fence wire until his smile passed. Juniper ate half. Then she stepped aside. The 5 did not rush. They looked to her first. That was what Rowan remembered most. He remembered how the young ones watched her, how their whole world seemed to pause until she allowed it. She flicked her short tail once. They came like shadows learning to be bodies. The smallest reached the stone first, then flattened when a raindrop fell from a weed onto its back. Another stepped around a yellow leaf near the food, as if the leaf had made a poor impression. One sniffed the enamel pan, touched the rim with one paw, and jerked back at the cool metal. The boldest took one bite and immediately looked toward Rowan Kepi hat round alarm. Rowan kept his hands folded. He thought of Elise at Moat 3 years old, refusing peas unless Clara arranged them in a smiling face. He thought of all the ways small lives asked for permission without words. The memory did not hurt the way he expected. It came warm and sad together. Juniper stood between the young ones and Rowan, but she no longer blocked them completely. Her body had shifted just enough to make room for possibility. When the food was gone, the young ones scattered back toward cover. One carried away a piece too large, dropped it, pounced on it, then looked startled by its own enthusiasm. Another left a muddy print on the flat stone. The smallest drank with quick pink flashes of tongue, then sneezed into the dish and startled itself backward. Juniper watched Rowan during all of it. Not softly, not fondly, but steadily. When the last young one disappeared, she stepped onto the road's edge. Her paw pressed into the damp dust near the enamel pan. For a moment she stood there with the morning light laying silver along her back, her pale muzzle lifted, the crescent notch in her ear sharp as memory. Then she turned and walked away. After she vanished into the rabbit brush, Rowan approached to collect the pan. He stopped before reaching it. There, on the broken edge of the old porch plank he had set down days earlier to steady the dishes, was one clear muddy paw print. Juniper S. 4 rounded toes. No claws. A soft pad pressed deep enough to hold rainwater in its hollow. Rowan stared at it a long while. It was not gratitude. He knew better. It was not a promise. It was not a tame creature's gift. It was only a track left by a wild animal who had stood near his offering and gone on being herself. Still, he did not wipe it away. That evening, Ruth noticed the mud on his sleeve and the smile he was hiding badly. "Good morning?" she asked. "Had a breakfast meeting." "With who?" "Someone particular," Rowan said. Ruth narrowed her eyes. "Does this someone like biscuits?" "Not yet," Rowan said. The word yet stayed with him all the way home, risky and bright, with the smell of wet gravel still clinging to his boots. By the second week, Rowan's mornings had become careful enough to feel almost ceremonial. He woke while the windows were still blue, before Dottie and the hens began their complaints. The kitchen held the cool smell of ashes in the stove and coffee darkening in the pot. He would stand at the counter with his hand around the chipped blue mug, listening to the house settle, then pack Juniper S. food with the attention he had once given Clara S. medicines. Small portions. Clean water. Same distance. Watch the leg. No crowding. The cooler rode on the passenger floor. The enamel pan sat beside it, wrapped in Clara's old blue towel so it would not rattle. Rowan had discovered that rattling displeased Juniper. The first time the pan knocked against the door, she vanished into the culvert so completely that even the grass seemed embarrassed for him. After that, he cushioned everything. At the bend in Larkspur Road, he always slowed. Sometimes Juniper waited in the rabbit brush. Sometimes she watched from farther back among the cedars, her body striped by branches, her pale muzzle no brighter than a stone. Sometimes only the crescent notch of her ear showed for a breath, then disappeared. Rowan accepted each version of her as if Ia hot were a different kind of weather. He gave the low 2-note whistle, set the water down, and stepped back. The young ones learned the pattern too. Not trust, not exactly. Pattern. A wild creature could use a pattern without belonging to it. One of the 5, the smallest with a smudge of darker fur across its nose, circled the food 3 times before choosing the same side every morning. Another climbed onto the flat stone after breakfast and stared at the empty place where food had been, as if complaining. The boldest developed a deep suspicion of Rowan's left glove. Whenever the glove hung from his belt, that little bobcat eyed it with such serious distrust that Rowan began tucking it into his pocket. "Don't worry," he told the glove once. "It's personal now." Juniper flicked one ear at his voice, unimpressed. After morning feedings, Rowan went to work. He mended a south pasture fence for the Brennans, repaired a sheep gate for old Mr. Voss, and spent 2 afternoons replacing wire along Ruth Bell's lower lot while her goats inspected every tool he placed on the ground. One goat, white with one black knee, carried off his pencil and chewed the eraser with the confidence of a professional thief. Ruth laughed hard enough to lean against the gate. "See," she said, "everybody on this ridge wants something from your pockets." Rowan pretended to check his tool belt. If Juniper starts taking pencils, Mort met retiring. The name came easier now when spoken to Ruth or Mara. With Juniper, he mostly used quiet sounds. The whistle, the scrape of the pan, the soft closing of the truck door. He had begun to believe she knew him by the order of those small things more than by his face. Mara called every other evening at first, then stopped by twice in person. She crouched near the road, studied tracks, watched Juniper's gait through binoculars, and nodded cautiously when she saw more weight settling onto the injured foreleg. "Improving," she said. "Not perfect, but improving." Rowan felt relief move through him so strongly he had to look at the fence line. "Good." Mara glanced at him. "Remember, improvement may mean she leaves." Moat no. He said it because it was true. He also said it because he needed practice. That became the private lesson of those days. He was helping Juniper become able to need him less. Every pan of water, every measured meal, every careful step back from her path worked toward the morning she might not be there at all. Love, if that was what had begun to gather quietly inside him, had chosen an inconvenient shape. It wore tawny fur, walked on silent paws, and had no obligation to stay. Still, daily life softened around her. In the evenings, Rowan sometimes found Juniper in the cedar shadows above his fence line. She had begun ranging farther from the culvert as her strength returned. She never came down to the house. She only watched from the slope while he fed the hens or carried split wood to the porch. Dottie noticed her once and gave a scandalized cluck that made 3 other hens rush in the wrong direction. Juniper blinked slowly, as if domestic poultry were a disappointing idea. Rowan turned toward the woodpile to hide his smile. Another evening, he dropped a fence staple near the gate and spent a full minute searching the dust while Juniper watched from above. When he finally found it stuck in his cuff, he held the staple up toward the cedars. "Found it," he said. Juniper yawned. Her teeth flashed briefly, sharp and white. Then she settled her chin on her paws with the air of someone who had known all along. The ridge took on new sounds. The soft clink of the enamel pan, the low whistle at dawn, the occasional chirr of a young bobcat hidden in weeds. Even the quiet felt layered now, less like absence and more like listening. At night, Rowan washed the pan in the kitchen sink and dried it with the blue towel. He placed it by the door where he would not forget. The chipped mug sat beside it sometimes, and he caught himself thinking the counter no longer looked like a shrine to what was gone. It looked like preparation. That difference mattered. He told Elise only a little on Sunday, an injured bobcat, Mara watching over it, everything being done properly. His daughter went quiet in the way she did when worry was choosing its shoes. "Dad," she said gently. Moat meant being careful. Moat no. Moat diu et day don't want you getting hurt. Rowan looked out the dark kitchen window. His reflection stared back. Older than he felt near that gravel road. Softer around the eyes. "Mut think careful can still hurt," he said. "But it es better than closed." Elise's voice warmed. Mom would have said that sounded almost wise. Rowan smiled into the dim glass. Outside, from somewhere beyond the porch light, a faint sound moved through the cedar dark. Not close, not tame, only present. For the first time in a long while, Rowan left the second mug in the cupboard and did not feel quite so alone. Joy returned to Rowan's life in pieces so small that he might have missed them if Juniper had not made him slow enough to notice. It came first in the mornings, when the sun lifted over the east pasture and turned every stem of dry grass gold. The gravel road held the night's coolness under its pale crust. Rowan would step from the truck with the enamel pan under his arm, and before he poured water, he felt the ridge watching. Then Juniper would appear. Sometimes she came from the culvert, sometimes from the cedar brake above the road, and once from behind the very fence post Rowan had been studying without seeing her. She sat there capite at her crescent-notched ear, tilted, and her bent whisker lit by dawn, looking disappointed that his eyesight had failed him. "You getting smug," he told her softly. Juniper blinked. That was all the answer he received, and somehow it was enough to make him smile through half the morning. Her leg had grown stronger. She still favored it after long rests, and Mara insisted Rowan keep reporting changes. But the guarded movement had eased into a careful unevenness. Juniper climbed the low ditch bank now instead of circling around it. She stretched after eating, claws briefly catching the dust before she pulled them in again. Once, she leapt onto a fallen cottonwood limb, wobbled for the smallest breath, and then pretended the wobble had been part of the plan. The 5 young ones learned boldness in uneven amounts. The smallest, with the dark smudge across its nose, became the first to follow Rowan's truck after breakfast. Not near it. It drifted along the ditch while he idled forward to turn around, stopping whenever he stopped, then pretending interest in a weed when he glanced over. Rowan named that one smudge in his mind, though he kept the name to himself. Another youngster, long-legged and narrow, loved climbing. It mounted rocks, roots, fence braces, and once the old sawhorse Rowan had left near the road while patching a rail. It stood there like a tiny monarch of unfinished carpentry until a grasshopper sprang beneath it. The little bobcat launched straight up, landed sideways, and disappeared in dust. Rowan kept his laughter quiet, but it stayed with him all afternoon. Warmth began collecting around ordinary objects. The old yellow bucket was one of them. Rowan used it for fence staples, and Juniper disliked it with steady conviction. If the bucket sat near the food, she would not pass it. If Rowan moved it behind the truck, she watched it anyway. One morning, a young one crept up, tapped the bucket with one paw, heard the hollow thump, and fled behind Juniper so fast that only its tail showed. Juniper looked at Rowan as if he were responsible for poor interior design. "Motluklunk, speak to the bucket," he said. He moved it after that. The rag from his tool belt became another matter. It was an old red shop rag, faded almost pink, used for wiping grease from his hands. Rowan had left it draped over the tailgate while setting water down. When he returned, it was gone. He searched beneath the truck, in the bed, beside the cooler, then saw Juniper 20 yards away in the rabbit brush, with the rag pinned beneath one forepaw. She did not chew it. She did not tear it. She only held it down and watched him, solemn as a bank teller. "That's mine," Rowan said. Juniper's ears moved forward. One of the young ones approached the rag and received a quiet tap from Juniper's paw. The little one sat back, affronted. Rowan stood in the road, hands on hips, feeling a happiness so plain it embarrassed him. A wild bobcat had stolen his dirty rag and refused to share it, and for the first time in months, he wished Clara could see something, because it was funny, not because it hurt. Eventually, Juniper left the rag in the grass. Rowan retrieved it with a stick, washed it at home, and hung it by the shed door. The next morning, he chose that rag again. Some joys came at dusk. After work, Rowan drove home along Larkspur Road, with the truck lights brushing pale tunnels through dust. Juniper sometimes appeared on the slope above the bend, keeping pace for a little distance between cedar trunks. Her eyes caught the headlights and released them. The young ones moved farther back, 5 quiet flickers among grass and stone. She never followed all the way to the house. She stopped at the old boundary where the road passed the split pine. Rowan understood that line as clearly as any fence. Beyond it was his porch, his hens, his kitchen sink, his blue mug. Before it was Juniper's chosen edge. She could watch. He could pass. Neither had to claim the other. That boundary gave him comfort. He had spent so much of grief trying to hold on to what had crossed beyond his reach. Juniper, by staying just out of reach, taught him another shape of closeness. He could care without enclosing. He could be glad without asking the gladness to move in. One evening, Ruth Bell waited by her gate and handed him warm corn muffins wrapped in a towel. "For you," she said, "not the committee in the ditch. The committee has strict dietary needs." Moat assumed. That's why Mort didn't frost them. From the hillside, Juniper watched. Ruth saw the pale flash of her muzzle and stood very still. Her face softened into quiet wonder. "She's smaller than Mott imagined," Ruth whispered. "She's larger than she lets on," Rowan said. A young bobcat sneezed in the weeds. Ruth pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from laughing too loudly. By late August, the ridge felt less empty to Rowan, though nothing had truly moved into his house. The broken porch step still needed repair. Clara's rosemary still leaned toward the sun. The white mug remained in the cupboard. Yet his evenings no longer ended with the radio filling silence for lack of anything better. Sometimes, he sat on the porch after supper and listened toward the road. Not waiting. Listening. The hens muttered in their coop. A night insect tapped itself against the porch light. Far down the ridge, too faint to be certain, gravel shifted once under a careful paw. Rowan closed his hand around the chipped blue mug and let the sound be enough. The first warning came in the shape of tracks where they did not belong. Rowan found them on a Thursday morning below the lower pasture, pressed into the damp sand along the dry creek bed where last week's rain still held in shaded places. He had gone down there to check a sagging wire near the cottonwoods, carrying a fence stretcher in one hand and his coffee in the other. The air smelled of wet leaves, dust, and the faint sourness of overripe chokecherries fallen beneath the brush. At first, he saw Juniper's prints. He knew them now, round, quiet, clawless, with the slight unevenness that came when she favored her healing leg. Beside them were the smaller prints of the 5 young ones, overlapping in soft confusion where they had moved through the sand together. One track had stepped directly into another, as if Smudge had walked where someone else had already proved the earth safe. Rowan smiled at that. Then he stopped. Beyond the bobcat prints, crossing hard from the creek bed toward the fence line, were larger marks. Not bobcat, not deer. The toes were longer, the claws visible, the stride loose and ranging. Coyote, maybe more than one. And beside those, half scuffed by gravel, was a print that looked heavier, broader, less wild in its shape. A dog. Rowan stood in the creek shadow with his coffee going cold. The ridge had always held coyotes. Their calls rose some nights like thin silver wires in the dark, and he had never hated them for being what they were. But the prints were close to the culvert path. Too close. The heavier dog track troubled him more. Domestic animals wandered when people let them, and wandering hunger had a clumsy courage wild hunger did not always have. He crouched, touched the edge of one print without disturbing it, and felt the damp sand crumble against his finger. "Fresh," he murmured. A cottonwood leaf dropped beside his boot with a soft tap. When he reached the culvert later that morning, Juniper was already there, But she was not waiting in her usual way. She paced along the rabbit brush, not far, never wasting movement, but back and forth across the same 12 feet of ground. Her crescent-notched ear turned toward every sound. Her bent whisker trembled when she lifted her nose. She did not sit when Rowan whistled. The 5 young ones stayed hidden longer than usual. Rowan placed the water and stepped back. Juniper approached, smelled the pan, then looked past him toward the lower pasture. Her tail gave 2 hard flicks. She drank only a little. When Smudge crept forward too soon, she cut across his path so quickly the young one flattened into the dust with wide, offended eyes. "Rough morning?" Rowan asked softly. Juniper did not eat until he had moved another 10 feet away. Even then, she took the food in pieces and carried it toward the culvert mouth, pausing between trips to stare down the road. One of the young ones tried to bat at a dry grass stem, missed, and tumbled gently into a sibling. Usually Juniper ignored that sort of nonsense, unless it drew them too far into the open. That morning, she gave a low warning sound. Both little bodies froze, as if the grass itself had scolded them. The warmth that usually came to Rowan at breakfast stayed folded small inside him. He called Mara from the truck. She listened without interrupting, while he described the tracks. The dog print. Juniper S-pacing. The young ones keeping low. "Motluklunk come by afternoon," she said. "Dante changed the routine yet. Just watch. Watch." It sounded simple until a person cared. Rowan worked badly that day. He tightened wire at the Brennan place and had to redo one stretch because his mind kept returning to the creek bed. He dropped 3 staples in the grass. He set his pliers on a post and spent 10 minutes searching for them while they sat directly in front of him. When the Brennan boy asked if he was looking for his glasses, Rowan remembered he was wearing them. The boy grinned. "My grandpa does that." "Motmet honored," Rowan said. The joke landed softly, but worry followed him back into the truck. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted from the west, carrying the dry scent of pine needles and dust. Mara met him near the culvert with binoculars and a quiet face. Together they walked the lower pasture. She knelt over the tracks, took a few photos, and looked toward the far cattle trail where the old logging cut entered the ridge. "Coyotes," she said, "and likely a dog. Maybe 2. Could be from the hunting cabins beyond the county line. They should be running loose." "No," Mara said. "They should tea." There was anger in her voice, but it was controlled, folded under duty. On their way back, they found another sign, a tuft of tawny fur snagged on low wire near the split pine. Rowan's chest tightened before Mara touched it. "Not from a wound," she said gently. "Just caught fur." Rowan nodded, but his throat had gone dry. At the road, Juniper watched them from the cedar shadows. She had climbed higher than usual, standing on a flat rock, with her body long and alert. The 5 young ones gathered behind her in uneven patience. The climber balanced on a root, then slowly slid off backward without meaning to. Under any other sky, Rowan would have smiled. That evening, he only let the small foolishness steady him. Ruth Bell came by just before dusk with a jar of soup wrapped in a towel. "You look like you forgot how to come indoors," she said. Something's been through the lower pasture. Her face changed. Bad something? Maybe just careless something. Ruth looked toward the road. Careless can do plenty. That sentence stayed with Rowan after she left. Night settled slowly over Larkspur Ridge. The porch boards cooled under his boots. Dottie and the hens muttered themselves into sleep. The chipped blue mug sat warm in his hand, but he barely drank from it. Down near the road, Beyond the split pine and the dark ribbon of gravel, Juniper remained unseen. Still, Rowan felt her restlessness moving through the ridge. He had learned not to expect wild things to stay. He had learned not to confuse routine with a promise. But that night, as the wind touched Clara S. Rosemary and made the gate latch click once in the dark, he understood something he did not want to name. The ridge was holding its breath again. And this time, so was he. The wind began before sunset, like a restless hand moving through the ridge. It came across the upper pasture in long dry breaths, bending the grass, rattling loose tin, and turning the cottonwood leaves pale side up. By 4 o'clock, dust had gathered along Larkspur Road in low twisting sheets. The air smelled of pine pitch and rain that had not yet fallen. Rowan stood beside the truck with one boot on the running board and watched the western hills darken. He should have gone home. Mara had told him not to crowd Juniper when weather changed. Animals knew storms in their bones long before people admitted the sky had shifted. A wild mother or guardian or whatever fierce shape Juniper had taken for the 5 young ones might move them to higher cover. She might refuse food. She might vanish for a day and return when the world quieted. Rowan knew all that. Knowing did not make his hands less uneasy. He drove slowly down to the culvert, headlights still off, gravel popping under the tires. At the bend, a jackrabbit bolted from the grass and vanished so suddenly that Rowan's heart jumped. Near the split pine, the old yellow bucket rolled from the truck bed. It clanged once against the tailgate. From the ditch, 5 small bodies disappeared as if the earth had swallowed them. "Sorry," Rowan whispered, though none of them owed him forgiveness. Juniper appeared a moment later, not from the culvert, but from the cedar slope above it. She stood high on the flat rock, her body cut sharp against the bruised sky. Her crescent-notched ear flattened sideways. Her tail twitched once, then went still. The bent white whisker trembled in the wind. She looked not at Rowan, but past him, down the road. Rowan turned. Nothing moved there except dust. He set the pan and food in their usual place, then stepped back farther than usual. The wind tugged at his hat brim. A tumble of dry grass scraped across the gravel and caught against his boot. Juniper did not come down. The 5 young ones made no sound. "Juniper," he said softly, then gave the 2-note whistle. Her head turned toward him. For one beat, the ridge seemed to hold still. Then from far beyond the lower pasture came the sound Rowan had been dreading, a long, uneven coyote call, answered by another, thinner one from the logging cut. The young bobcats stirred. One gave a faint chirr that the wind almost carried away. Juniper leapt down from the rock with sudden strength. She landed lightly, paused only a breath on the mending foreleg, and moved into the rabbit brush, not toward food or water, toward the young ones. A small warmth tried to break through the fear when Smudge darted out with a grass stem stuck absurdly across his muzzle, looking for one confused second like he had grown a crooked mustache. Another youngster bumped into him, then backed up as if it were catching. The climber scrambled onto a low stone, misjudged the wind, and slid off backward into the weeds. Normally, Rowan would have smiled. That evening, the sight only made him love their fragile foolishness more. Juniper gathered them with sounds too low for Rowan to understand. She did not touch each one gently. She blocked, nudged, corrected, turned. Her body became direction. Her ears became orders. The 5 obeyed in broken pieces, vanishing and reappearing around her legs. Rowan took one step without meaning to. Juniper's head snapped toward him. He stopped. Her eyes held his across the wind, not pleading, not trusting, warning him back into the place where he belonged. The look went through him with clean force. He had wanted to help by moving closer, but closeness had not been the help she needed. He stepped back. The old lesson returned, sharper now. Love did not always get to be the hand. Sometimes love had to be the distance that let a wild thing choose its own way through danger. Juniper looked away first. She turned up the slope toward the cedars. One by one, the 5 followed. Smudge stumbled over a root and righted himself. The bold one looked back at the untouched food, as if disappointed by the weather. The smallest paused beside the enamel pan, sniffed the rim, sneezed dust from its nose, and hurried after the others. The last shape Rowan saw was Juniper's notched ear passing between 2 dark trunks. Then she was gone. Rain came after midnight. It struck hard against the roof in sudden gusts, then softened, then struck again. Rowan lay awake, listening to the storm move around the house. The porch step thumped under loose water. The gate latch clicked and clicked. Dottie clucked once from the coop, as if filing a complaint with the weather itself. He tried to tell himself this was ordinary. Bobcats moved. Bobcats hid. Bobcats knew cedar cover better than he knew the rooms of his own house. Juniper had survived before Rowan ever placed water in an enamel pan. She had crossed nights without his worry, following her like a lantern. Still, near 2 in the morning, a sound rose from the lower ridge. Coyotes. Not close enough to see, close enough to imagine. Rowan sat up. The chipped blue mug from supper stood on the bedside table, half full and cold. He put both feet on the floor and waited, every nerve turned toward the dark. No bobcat cried out. No rush of paws came up the road. Only rain, wind, and the thin wild calling beyond the pasture. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The world outside looked rinsed and bruised. Pine needles lay scattered across the porch. Clairess rosemary leaned sideways, shining with water. Rowan drove to the culvert before coffee, before hens, before scents. The food was gone, but not cleanly. The pan lay tipped on its side. Mud striped the flat stone. Grass near the culvert had been pressed and twisted by hurried movement. Juniper was not there. Neither were the 5. Rowan whistled once. The sound fell into the wet road and did not come back. Rowan searched the culvert first, because it was the only place his fear knew how to begin. He crouched in the wet gravel with rain soaking through the knees of his jeans and aimed Mara's small red-lensed flashlight into the round dark mouth beneath the road. The beam touched slick stone, mud, a few strands of pale fur caught on a rough edge, and nothing else. The smell of wet leaves and cold metal breathed out at him. "Juniper," he whispered. Only water answered, dripping somewhere deeper in the pipe. He knew better than to crawl in. Mara had told him twice, and common sense told him a third time. A trapped or frightened bobcat did not need a man blocking the only exit. But standing still felt impossible, so Rowan circled the culvert, then the ditch, then the rabbit brush where the grass had been flattened by hurried bodies. Tracks crossed over tracks. Juniper S. print appeared once in the mud near the flat stone, sharp at the front, blurred at the rear, where she had pushed off quickly. The young ones had scattered around her, their small round marks tangled with rain dimples. Beyond them, near the road edge, were longer clawed prints. Coyote. And one heavier dog track. Rowan stood very slowly. His hands felt cold even inside his gloves. He called Mara before the sun cleared the ridge. His voice sounded strange to him, too flat, as if some part of him had already stepped away to keep from feeling the rest. "She's gone," he said. Mara did not waste words. Mort met coming. While he waited, he walked the road in widening lines. He looked beneath cedar branches, along the dry creek, beside the split pine where the boundary had always held. Rain dripped from every needle. His boots sank into soft patches and slipped on clay. Twice he thought he saw movement, and found only a wet weed releasing itself from another. A meadowlark sang from the fence. The sound felt almost cruel in its brightness. At the lower pasture, he found the red shop rag. Juniper had taken it 3 days before and left it somewhere in the rabbit brush, but now it lay snagged on a low thorn beside the trail toward the creek. Rain had darkened it to the color of old brick. Rowan picked it up carefully, as if it might still hold warmth. For a foolish second, he pressed it between both hands. Then he tucked it into his coat. Mara arrived with 2 volunteers from the wildlife office, a quiet young man named Ben, and an older woman named Celia, who carried binoculars and moved through brush as if she had been born under it. Ruth Bell came too, though Rowan had not called her. She stood at the road with a thermos, her gray hair pinned crookedly, eyes full of the kind of worry that did not ask permission. "Mort brought coffee," she said. Rowan nodded. "Thank you. You drink some, or Mort le Glunk follow you around with it." Mort, believe you. That small exchange warmed the air for half a breath. Then the search swallowed them again. Mara studied the tracks and marked places with orange tape. She spoke softly into her radio. She told Rowan Vey Kep Hatate they knew and what they did not know. The Bobcats had left the culvert area in a hurry. They had gone uphill first, then split or circled near the dry creek, where rain had ruined the clearest signs. There was no evidence of a struggle at the culvert itself. No clear sign of injury beyond the old limp. "That's good," Mara said. Rowan wanted to believe her. They searched through the morning. The ridge seemed larger than it ever had. Every draw opened into another draw. Every cedar shadow held its shape too long. Rowan gave the 2-note whistle until his mouth went dry. He hated the sound by noon. It no longer felt like a familiar signal. It felt like calling into a house after everyone had left. At one point, Ben found a small print beneath a bent grass stem. "Kitten," he said. Rowan came too quickly and nearly slipped. The print was tiny, clean, and alone in a pocket of mud where the rain had not reached. Smudge. Maybe. Or the climber. Or one of the others Rowan had never dared name. The sight of it made his chest ache with tenderness. Celia placed one hand near the print but did not touch it. "Still moving," she said gently. Rowan looked up through the wet branches. "Which way?" Celia pointed toward the higher cedar brake. They followed until stone swallowed the trail. By afternoon, the sky cleared into a hard, pale blue. Steam lifted from the road. Wet sage filled the air with a sharp, almost clean smell. Rowan S. jeans dried stiff against his legs. Ruth made him eat half a biscuit beside the truck, tearing it into his hand as if feeding a stubborn horse. "Chew," she said. He obeyed because arguing took more strength. A young volunteer mentioned setting a trail camera near the creek. Mara agreed. Rowan carried one of the cameras himself and fastened it to a pine with trembling fingers. The strap would not catch. He tried twice, then a third time. Finally, Ruth stepped beside him and held the camera steady without saying anything. When it clicked into place, Rowan looked away. He had not cried when Clara's white mug went back into the cupboard. He had not cried the first morning Juniper drank in front of him. Grief had taught him restraint, until restraint felt like duty. But standing there with mud on his boots and a camera pointed at an empty trail, he felt something in him give way. Not loudly. Not fully. Just enough that he had to bend forward with both hands on his knees. Ruth rested her palm between his shoulder blades. "Oh, Rowan." He shook his head once. He did not know whether he was apologizing, refusing comfort, or trying to keep himself from becoming the kind of man who begged the trees. Mara gave him time. The ridge grew quiet around them. A squirrel scolded from somewhere had above, deeply offended by the gathering of humans. One of Ruth's biscuits fell from the truck seat, and a bold magpie landed near it, hopping sideways with criminal intention. Ruth shooed it with her hat, muttering that even birds on this road lacked manners. Rowan almost laughed, and that almost was mercy. They searched until dusk. They found no Juniper. No 5 young bodies. No crescent-notched ear watching from cedar shade. When the light began to thin, Mara touched Rowan's sleeve. "We stop for tonight." He looked toward the darkening road. She came when she heard the whistle. Sometimes Mara said softly, and sometimes wild things answer by staying hidden. Rowan nodded because he had no words left. He drove home with the enamel pan empty on the passenger floor and the red rag tucked inside his coat. At the porch, the broken step gave its familiar hollow knock beneath his boot. In the kitchen, the chipped blue mug waited beside the sink. For the first time since Juniper had appeared, the house felt enormous again. Rowan did not sleep so much as drift around the edges of sleep until the ridge turned gray. He woke before the alarm, before the hens, before the first truck on the county road miles below. For a moment he lay still and listened to the house. The refrigerator hummed. A board ticked in the hallway. Rainwater slipped from the porch roof in slow, leftover drops. Nothing outside called. The red shop rag lay folded on the chair beside his bed. He had placed it there without deciding to, as if it were something that needed watching through the night. By dawn, the kitchen had the hollow chill that came after storms. Rowan made coffee, poured it into the chipped blue mug, and left half of it untouched. Dottie began scolding from the coop as soon as she heard the back door, but even she sounded softer in the washed morning. The world smelled of mud, pine needles, and the faint sweetness of wet grass warming under a reluctant sun. He fed the hens because living things still needed ordinary care. Dottie stepped onto the toe of his boot and glared up at him as if his grief had delayed breakfast. "You rewrite," he murmured. "Bad management." She pecked one grain from the coffee can and seemed to accept the apology. The small ridiculousness steadied him enough to walk to the truck. The enamel pan sat on the passenger floor. The blue towel was damp at one corner. He had packed food without hope, or with hope buried so deep it did not dare show its face. The low 2-note whistle already hurt in his mouth before he used it. He drove down Larkspur Road slowly. The gravel was still wet in shaded places, but the open stretches had begun to dry. Dust did not rise as usual. It clung low to the road, pale and fine, waiting for the sun. The split pine appeared ahead, dark against the rinsed sky. Beyond it, the culvert bend lay empty. Rowan stopped the truck. He did not get out right away. The place looked exactly as it had the evening before, and not at all the same. The rabbit brush leaned under beads of water. The flat stone shone clean where rain had washed it. The culvert mouth held darkness. No pale muzzle. No notched ear. No small shapes fumbling through grass. He opened the door. The hinge gave its familiar tired groan. Somewhere uphill, a jay screamed once and went silent. Rowan carried the pan to the usual spot. His knees felt older than they had the week before. He poured water, set food on the stone, and stepped back. Then he gave the whistle. 2 low notes, falling at the end. They moved through the damp road and into the cedars. Nothing answered. Rowan lowered his head. He stood there long enough for a drop of water to slide from the brim of his hat onto his wrist. He watched it run over the back of his hand, catching in the creases of his skin, and thought how strange it was that the body kept doing small things when the heart had gone still. Then gravel shifted behind him. Not ahead. Behind. Rowan turned slowly. At first, he saw only dust beginning to lift in the first gold light. It rose behind his truck in a thin brown veil, just as it had the evening he had first seen her. Then a shape stepped out of it. Juniper. She stood in the middle of Larkspur Road, with her head low, her body lean and wet along the legs, her crescent-notched ear torn clear against the morning. Her pale muzzle was muddy. Burrs clung to one shoulder. She held her injured foreleg carefully, but she was standing. Rowan forgot how to breathe. Juniper did not come to him. She did not hurry. She simply watched him with those yellow eyes, wild and tired and entirely her own. Behind her, another shape appeared. Small, silent, dust-colored. Then another. Then 3 more, slipping from the road's edge and cedar shade until 5 young bobcats stood scattered behind Juniper like pieces of dawn that had not yet learned where to settle. Rowan's hand went to the truck door. He did not open it wider. He only needed something solid under his fingers. Smudge was there, dark-nosed Smudge unmistakable, one ear flattened by a wet seed head stuck to it. The climber limped on no leg at all, but managed to step onto a loose stone and slide off it immediately, recovering with grave embarrassment. The bold one stared at Moff the food, past Rowan's boots, with such fierce longing that even sorrow had to make room for a smile. One of the quieter young ones shook a back paw, because mud clung between its toes. The smallest sneezed twice, then looked personally betrayed by morning air. They were thin. They were soaked. They were alive. Juniper took 1 step forward. Then another. Rowan understood only when she passed him. She was not coming to the water. She was leading them down the road. Past him. With him. He stood still as she moved by at a careful distance, close enough for him to see the bend in her white whisker, far enough that her wildness remained untouched. The 5 followed unevenly, some in the ditch, some on the gravel, one darting behind the truck tire before thinking better of it. They did not walk like pets. They walked like frightened survivors using the road, because Juniper had decided it was safer than the brush. Rowan turned and walked too. Not in front. Not reaching. Just along the road, slow as a fence post shadow, matching the pace she allowed. His boots made soft sounds in the damp gravel. Juniper's paws made almost none. The young ones rustled in weeds beside him, appearing and disappearing. Once, Smudge crossed behind his heels so quickly that Rowan had to stop mid-step, one boot hovering foolishly in the air. The small bobcat froze and stared at him as if Rowan had created the inconvenience. "All right," Rowan whispered. "You go first." Smudge went first. They moved toward the bend where the road widened near the old loafing shed below Rowan's property, not all the way to the house, not into his world, but closer than Juniper had ever chosen. The sun lifted behind them. Dust rose around their legs in pale ribbons. Rowan felt the shape of the moment settle into him, not as triumph, not as ownership, but as a trust too fragile to name aloud. Mara's truck appeared at the far end of the road and stopped. She got out slowly, one hand raised to show she would not approach. Ruth Bell stood beside her, still in house slippers, one hand over her mouth. Coffee, thermos, tucked under her arm like she had forgotten why she brought it. Juniper paused. She looked at the humans, the shed, the open fence, the road behind her. Then she stepped into the shade near the loafing shed and let the five gather around her. Rowan stopped 10 feet away. His eyes burned, but he stayed quiet. Juniper lowered herself carefully onto the dry earth beneath the shed roof. The young ones pressed near, not touching for long, never still for long. One batted at a dangling piece of twine and startled when it swung back. Another discovered the blue towel Rowan had dropped near the gate days before and sat on one corner with solemn possession. Juniper looked at Rowan once. Only once. Then she closed her eyes halfway, exhausted but no longer running. Rowan stood in the morning dust and understood that she had not returned because she belonged to him. She had returned because, when the night became too hard, the road to him had remained in her memory. Mara made the boundary before anyone made a mistake. She walked the edge of the old loafing shed with Rowan at her side, measuring distance not with tape but with her eyes, the way people did when the important thing was not lumber but trust. The shed stood below Rowan's pasture, half open to the east, with a slanted tin roof and boards smelling of sun-baked dust, old hay and rain-dried years ago. A swallow's empty nest clung beneath a beam. Juniper lay in the shade with her forelegs tucked under her, eyes half open, watching every step. The five young ones slept and woke in little turns around her. Smudge had claimed a shallow hollow near the back wall. The climber had already found the lowest crossbeam and was trying to decide whether weakness should stop ambition. The smallest sat beside the blue towel, one paw planted on it, as if the towel had been subdued in battle. "That one's yours now." "Bobcats," Rowan murmured. The smallest blinked slowly, then sneezed. Mara lifted a hand. "We keep this simple. Water here. Food here. No one past this line unless Mut say so. We set the game camera on the post. We leave the gate open toward the cedar draw. They need an exit, they understand." Rowan nodded. The words "gate open" settled strangely in him. Since Clara's death, he had spent so much time closing things, cupboard doors, pasture gates, the lid on boxes of old photographs, the rooms he did not want to enter after dark. Now, helping meant leaving a way out. He found that harder than he expected. Together they arranged the shed, without making it feel arranged. Rowan cleared rusted wire from the corner, moved a cracked feed tub, and carried away boards with nails curling from them like old thorns. Mara set a shallow water basin near the open side and placed food farther from the humans than from the cedar escape route. Ruth Bell arrived with gloves, a broom, and a seriousness that made even her house slippers seem official. "Mortem sweeping only where the bobcats are not," she announced. Mara said, "That is exactly the correct kind of sweeping." Ruth nodded. "Good. Mort like being medically approved." Juniper watched them all, with narrowed yellow eyes. When Ruth's broom scraped too loudly against a board, Juniper lifted her head and gave a low rasp. Ruth froze so completely that the broom stayed midair. "Apologies," Ruth whispered. "Bad broom." The bold young bobcat peeked from behind Juniper's shoulder as if agreeing. Smudge stood, stretched his front paws, and immediately sat down again, apparently exhausted by the decision. The climber managed to get both front paws onto the crossbeam, hung there for 3 seconds with immense determination, then dropped into the straw and looked around as if hoping no one had seen. Rowan turned his face toward the doorway. He had needed that almost laugh. Mara examined Juniper from a distance through binoculars. The limp had worsened after the night away, but there was no sign that she could not bear weight. She was thinned, tired, and bristling with dignity that made pity feel rude. Burrs clung to her shoulder. Mud had dried in a pale stripe along one side. Her crescent-notched ear twitched at flies. The bent whisker curved away from her muzzle, like a question she had no intention of answering. "She needs rest," Mara said quietly. "Food, water, quiet. If she declines, we intervene. If she improves, we let her choose." Rowan looked at Juniper. "Let her choose." Those 3 words were the shape of the whole arrangement. For the next several days, life narrowed to the shed and the line no one crossed. Rowan came at dawn and again at dusk. He placed water, changed the camera battery, checked for signs Mara had taught him to see, then backed away. He did not whistle every time now. Sometimes silence was kinder. Sometimes Juniper looked too tired for familiar sounds. The young ones recovered faster than she did. Their hunger sharpened into curiosity. One discovered a beetle and followed it with such solemn attention that it nearly walked into the water basin. Another pawed at a loose straw stem, leapt backward when the stem moved, then returned to punish it. Smudge developed the habit of sitting exactly where Rowan intended to place the second dish, forcing him to wait with the dish in his hand until Smudge decided dignity required relocation. "You are inconvenient," Rowan whispered once. Smudge looked at him as if that was the goal. Juniper remained watchful. Even when she dozed, her ears moved. When the young ones wandered too near the boundary line, she made a short sound that pulled them back like an invisible string. Once, the bold one crossed farther than the rest and stood only 6 feet from Rowan's boot. Rowan froze, hand still on the water jug, while the little bobcat sniffed a wet patch on the gravel and sneezed with great violence. Juniper rose halfway. Rowan stepped back before she had to ask. The young one fled behind a post, offended by both man and nose. That night, Rowan sat on the porch with the chipped blue mug cooling beside him, and understood that every backward step had become part of the healing, not only Juniper's, his own. He had once thought love proved itself by staying near, by holding on, by refusing to let the dark take anything else. But the shed below the pasture taught him a slower truth. Sometimes love was the open gate. Sometimes it was clean water placed and then abandoned. Sometimes it was letting the creature you cared for keep its teeth, its silence, its right to disappear. On the fourth evening, Juniper stood without trembling. She limped to the water basin, drank, and then sat in the open while sunset warmed the tin roof above her. The five gathered nearby, restless but calmer. The smallest dragged the blue towel 2 inches, grew tired, and lay on top of it. The climber slept with one paw against the crossbeam, perhaps dreaming of higher places. Smudge blinked at Rowan from the straw, as if supervising poor human work. Rowan stood beyond the boundary and gave one soft nod. Juniper did not nod back. She only lowered her head to wash one paw, slow and deliberate, as if the world had not frightened her into forgetting who she was. That was healing too. Not sweetness. Not tameness. Only a wild thing remembering herself in a safe enough shade. The 5 young bobcats became separate in Rowan's mind before he admitted he had given them names. At first, he told himself the names were only practical. Mara needed clear descriptions for her notes. The trail camera needed labels. Rowan needed a way to say which one had coughed near the water basin, which one had climbed the crossbeam, which one had limped after sleeping in a strange position. Practical names, he told himself. But when he stood at the shed, one cool morning Vey kept ite hot mist hanging low in the draw and the smell of damp straw rising from the shaded earth, he knew better. Names had entered the place the way light entered through cracks in old boards, quietly and without asking permission. Smudge came first because the dark blur across his nose made him look as if he had dipped his muzzle in stove ash. He remained the cautious one, circling new objects 3 times before accepting their right to exist. If Rowan moved the water basin 6 inches, Smudge studied the change as though water itself had betrayed him. Once, a grasshopper landed on his front paw, and Smudge held that paw in the air, staring at it with grave uncertainty. Ruth, watching from beyond the boundary, whispered, "That one thinks too much." Rowan whispered back, "Mort respect that." The climber became cedar because no beam, stump, root, fence brace, or low branch escaped inspection. Cedar's body seemed built around the belief that the earth was a temporary inconvenience. He climbed badly at first, with more determination than grace, and often descended by sliding sideways into straw. Juniper rarely corrected him unless he climbed toward the open side of the shed. Then one sharp sound brought him down. The bold one became Flicker. She moved in quick starts, appearing in one place, vanishing, then reappearing nearer than Rowan expected. Flicker was the first to test the line between caution and curiosity. She sniffed Rowan's boot print after he stepped away. She pawed at the shadow of the swinging gate latch. She once carried a fallen cottonwood leaf in her mouth, then dropped it when the leaf touched her whiskers as if it had insulted her. The smallest kept the blue towel, and so Rowan called him Blue in his private thoughts. Mara raised an eyebrow when she heard it. Blue? He chose the towel. That's not scientific. Neither is him sitting on it every day like a land deed. Blue had a habit of falling asleep with one paw over his eyes, as if the world were too bright and busy. Yet when food arrived, he woke faster than all the others and gave a faint chirr that made Juniper's ear twitch. He remained thin, but the hollows along his sides softened as the days passed. The last one took longest to name. She was quieter than the rest, with a pale patch on her chest and a habit of sitting just behind Juniper's shoulder, watching without joining. She noticed everything: a raven on a post, Mara's binocular strap, Ruth's knitted sleeve, the way Rowan's knee clicked when he crouched. She became Willow because she bent around the world instead of pushing through it. 5 names. 5 tempers. 5 small wild lives Rowan had not meant to hold even in language. Juniper heard none of this as belonging. She still ruled the shed with the spare authority of hunger, warning, and memory. When Smudge hesitated too long near the food, she ate first and forced him to decide. When Cedar reached for a beam slick with rain, she cuffed the air near him without touching. When Flicker came too close to Ruth's broom, Juniper placed herself between them, so Ruth whispered another apology. "Mootmet's starting to feel judged by that animal," Ruth said. "You are," Rowan said. Ruth accepted this with a nod. Fair. Mara visited every 2 days now. She crouched outside the boundary and watched Juniper's movement improve. The limp remained, but strength returned beneath it. The 5 young ones gained shape, their coats less patchy, their eyes clearer, their play less frantic. They pounced on straw, stalked beetles, wrestled in brief silent bursts, then scattered when Juniper's head lifted at a distant sound. The trail camera showed what Rowan did not see. At night, Juniper led them out toward the cedar draw. Once it caught Flicker, springing at nothing, landing in surprise, and staring down as if the earth had moved. Another night, Cedar climbed halfway up a leaning post and froze there, apparently reconsidering his life. Mara showed Rowan the images on the small screen. He laughed so softly he nearly missed the next photo. Juniper standing alone at the open gate, head turned toward the dark road. The laughter left him slowly. "She is testing distance," Mara said. Rowan nodded. "Good." It was good. It was also the beginning of losing them properly. That thought did not crush him the way he had feared it might. It sat beside him, heavy but not cruel. He had known since the first pan of water that healing pointed away from him. Still, the shed had grown full of small arrivals. Straw rustled, paws tapped wood, Blue sneezed into dust. Flicker attacked a dangling twine until the twine won by swinging back. Smudge supervised the water basin. Cedar dreamed upward. Willow watched everything. A man could get used to such things. That evening, Rowan stood beyond the boundary while sunset turned the shed roof copper. Juniper sat with the 5 around her, not cuddled like pets, but near in the loose way wild families gathered when danger had stepped back for a while. Blue lay on the towel. Cedar rested against a post. Flicker batted once at her own tail and seemed mildly surprised to find it attached. Smudge washed his marked nose vein, capite hot excessive seriousness. Willow sat beside Juniper. Rowan felt Clara close then, not as grief but as memory warmed by usefulness. He imagined her telling him that a house did not have to be entered to become less empty. Sometimes life only had to pass near it, leave tracks in the dust, and remind a man that he was still able to care. Juniper looked toward him. Rowan gave no whistle, no step, no reaching hand. Only a quiet nod from the far side of the line. The 5 young bobcats shifted in the straw, each one themselves now, each one still wild, each one alive, because Juniper had brought them down the gravel road and trusted distance more than fear. September came quietly to Larkspur Ridge, not as a clean turning of the season, but as a soft thinning of light. The mornings grew cooler first. Rowan felt it in the handle of the water jug and in the way his breath briefly appeared when he stepped from the truck before sunrise. The grass along the road lost its brittle summer color and took on a pale silver at the tips. Chokecherry leaves yellowed near the dry creek. The old loafing shed held shadows longer now, and the tin roof clicked in the cold before the sun warmed it. Juniper improved by degrees that only people who watched closely would notice. She stood longer. She paced the boundary less. She slept vekepte hat her head down more often, though never so deeply that the world could surprise her. The limp remained, especially after cold nights, but it no longer ruled her movement. When she crossed the shed floor, she moved like a wild creature again, measured and silent, carrying pain as a private thing instead of a public burden. The 5 young ones had changed too. They were not the thin, rain-soaked shadows that had followed her down the gravel road. Smudge's nosemark looked darker against a healthier face. Cedar reached higher beams and came down with slightly less disaster. Flicker had grown quick enough that Rowan sometimes saw only the idea of her before she vanished. Blue still pate close to the towel, though he had begun abandoning it for longer explorations. Willow remained watchful, sitting where she could see Juniper, the road, and the open gate all at once. The shed had become part of the Ridge's rhythm. Not a pen. Not a home in the human sense. A pause. A place of safe shade and clean water. Ve Kepite had an open gate facing the cedar draw, and a man who knew where not to stand. Neighbors learned slowly and mostly behaved. Ruth told only those who needed to know, and she told them with such severity that even curious people became respectful. Mr. Voss stopped driving his old red tractor down the lower road at dawn. The Brennan boys were warned not to come looking, not even from a distance, and their mother made them repeat the rule aloud while holding feed sacks. A deputy spoke to the owners of the hunting cabins beyond the county line, and after that, no loose dog tracks appeared near the dry creek. Ruth called it the most civilized thing that had happened in the county all year. Rowan called it a relief. Some evenings, Mara came with the trail camera cards and sat with Rowan on the tailgate, the truck parked well away from the shed. They reviewed the nighttime images on the little screen, Juniper leading the 5 into the cedar draw, Flicker pouncing at a moth, Cedar halfway up a leaning pine, eyes shining like tiny lamps, Blue dragging the towel 3 feet toward the gate and then forgetting why, Smudge staring directly into the camera with deep suspicion. Mara laughed under her breath at that one. "He knows government equipment when he sees it," Rowan said. "He disapproves. He disapproves of most things." Their laughter stayed small, careful not to carry. At home, Rowan's house had not become loud, but it had stopped feeling sealed. The enamel pan was washed each evening and left by the door. The blue towel, after Blue finally surrendered it to a dry pile of straw, was washed and folded on the porch rail, full of pulls and faint claw marks. Rowan fixed the broken porch step at last, not because anyone asked, but because the hollow knock under his boot had begun to feel like unfinished business. Ruth noticed immediately. "Well," she said, testing the repaired step with one slipper. "Look at you, joining society." Dante spread it around. No promises. Dottie the hen also noticed the repair and avoided the step for 2 full days, apparently mistrusting improvement. Rowan found that funnier than he should have. Elise came one Sunday with Caleb, who was 7 now, and solemn about animals in the way some children were solemn about church. Mara had approved one distant look from the upper fence, provided they stayed quiet and left quickly. Caleb held Rowan's hand as they stood under the cottonwood, watching the shed through the pale afternoon. Juniper was visible only as a tawny shape in shade. Blue rolled briefly onto one side, then snapped upright as if embarrassed. Cedar swatted at a straw stem. Flicker appeared near the open gate and vanished again. Willow sat beside Juniper's shoulder. Smudge sniffed the water basin, walked around it twice, and accepted it for the day. Caleb whispered, "They not pets." "No," Rowan whispered back. "They neighbors." The boy thought about that with serious eyes. Good neighbors? Rowan looked at Juniper, at the crescent notch in her ear, and the bent white whisker catching a thin line of sun. "The best kind," he said. "They don't ask for much. And they remind you to pay attention." Elise did not speak for a while. When Rowan glanced at her, her face had softened in a way that made her look, suddenly, like Clara standing in garden light. "You sound better, Dad," she said quietly. Rowan looked back toward the shed. "Mote am not sure better is the word. What word would you use?" He watched Blue creep toward a fallen leaf, tap it, then low pay backward when the leaf moved in the breeze. "Open," he said. That evening, after Elise and Caleb left, Rowan drove down to the shed for the dusk routine. The sky had turned lavender over the ridge. Cold air collected near the road. Juniper waited near the gate, not inside the shed, not fully outside it. The 5 gathered behind her, restless and bright-eyed. Rowan set down water and stepped back. Juniper did not drink. Instead, she turned toward the cedar draw. One by one, the young ones followed her into the dim trees. Smudge paused to consider the water basin. Cedar climbed over a root because going around it was apparently beneath him. Blue looked back once from beside the towelless straw. Willow vanished almost at Juniper's heel. Flicker was gone before Rowan could track her. Juniper stopped at the edge of the cedars. She turned her head toward him. Not goodbye. Not promise. Only a look across a respectful distance, under a cooling sky, on a road that had learned to hold trust without keeping it. Rowan lifted his hand halfway, then lowered it. The gate stayed open. The dust settled softly where their paws had passed. By the first hard frost, Juniper and the 5 no longer slept in the loafing shed every night. Rowan knew because the straws stayed smooth. The water basin held no fresh dust along the rim, and the trail camera caught only a raccoon passing through with both hands, busy stealing something invisible from the ground. The raccoon paused, once beneath the shed beam, looked directly into the camera, and seemed disappointed by the lack of applause. Rowan showed the image to Ruth. "That animal has plans," she said. "Bad ones," Rowan answered. The humor came easier now. It did not erase anything. It simply lived beside what had hurt. Juniper still returned, but on her terms. Sometimes at dawn, Rowan found her prints crossing the gravel near the split pine, round and clean, with 5 younger trails scattered behind and around hers. Sometimes he saw Blue's smaller marks near the old towel, which now hung folded over the porch rail, after Rowan could not quite bring himself to put it away. Sometimes Cedar's tracks climbed absurdly over a fallen branch when the easier path lay beside it. Once, after an early snow dusted the road, Rowan stood there smiling at the evidence of Cedar's unnecessary adventure. "Still going over things," he murmured. The ridge seemed to answer with silence and falling snow. Juniper herself appeared less often than the young ones. When Rowan did see her, she looked stronger. Lean, watchful, marked by the crescent in her ear and the bent white whisker that had somehow survived storms of hunger and every brush pile on the ridge. Her limp remained faintly in cold weather, but it had become part of her movement rather than a plea inside it. She never crossed the open yard. She never came to the porch. Rowan was grateful for that. It would have been too easy for people to misunderstand, too easy for a tender story to turn careless, so he kept the line: water at the shed when needed, calls to Mara when signs changed, no hand feeding, no reaching, no invitations into human rooms. The gate remained open toward the cedar draw, even after frost silvered its hinges. Love did not close it. That was what Rowan had learned. One late November evening, the ridge settled under a sky the color of cooled ashes. Rowan had been stacking wood near the barn, while Dottie and the hens muttered from their coop, deeply offended by the season. His breath showed white in the air. The repaired porch step held firm beneath his boot whenever he crossed it, and that small, solid sound pleased him more than it should have. He carried the last armful inside, set 2 logs by the stove, and reached for the chipped blue mug on the counter. Then he heard gravel shift. Not near the house. Down by the road. He stepped onto the porch without turning on the light. The cold touched his face. Cedar branches moved gently against the dark. For a moment, nothing appeared except the pale strip of Larkspur Road where frost had begun to gather. Then Juniper came out from the shadow of the split pine. She paused in the road, almost exactly where Rowan had first seen her months before, though the dust was gone now, replaced by thin white frost that brightened beneath the moon. Behind her came the 5, no longer small enough to look fragile, no longer bold in the foolish way of hungry young things, but not grown beyond their old selves either. Smudge circled a patch of frost before stepping on it. Cedar climbed over a stone that did not need climbing. Flicker appeared on one side of Juniper, vanished behind brush, then appeared on the other. Blue paused near the ditch and sniffed the cold air with the solemn dignity of someone remembering a towel. Willow sat just behind Juniper's shoulder, watching everything. Rowan stood with one hand on the porch post. He did not whistle. The sound would have felt like asking. Juniper looked toward the house. The moon touched the pale fur under her chin. Her notched ear tilted once. She was not the desperate animal from the culvert. She was not the exhausted body beneath the loafing shed roof. She was herself, fully and quietly, with 5 young lives gathered behind her and the dark ridge opening around them. Rowan felt Clara near in that moment, not as a ghost, not as a wound, but as the warmth of an old sentence remembered at the right time. Nothing wastes emotion when it's wild. Juniper had wasted nothing. Not fear, not caution, not the road, not the memory of water placed at a distance, not the man who had learned to be useful without claiming what came near him. The 5 began moving first, drifting across the road toward the cedar draw. Juniper waited until each one had passed. Rowan watched Blue stop to shake frost from one paw. He watched Flicker spring lightly at a dead leaf and miss on purpose, or perhaps not. He watched Smudge Teu row no back once to inspect the place where Rowan's truck usually stood, as if ensuring the world had kept its arrangement. Then Juniper crossed last. At the edge of the trees, she turned her head. For one quiet breath, she and Rowan held the distance between them like something shared. He lifted 2 fingers from the porch post. Not a wave exactly. More like acknowledgement. Juniper did not soften. She did not hurry toward him. She did not become less wild for having remembered him. She only watched long enough for the cold to settle around both of them, then stepped between the cedars and disappeared with the 5. The road emptied. The frost kept their tracks. Rowan stayed outside until his hands ached from the cold. When he finally went in, he poured coffee into the chipped blue mug and left the white one in the cupboard. Not hidden. Not heavy. Just there, among other things that had belonged to a life and still had a place. Later, before bed, he folded the blue towel once more and set it on the bench by the door. He did not know if Blue would ever touch it again. He did not know if Juniper would return tomorrow, next week, or only as tracks after snow. But the house did not feel empty while he wondered. It felt open. The ridge grew quiet after that, the way good stories often do when they have given all they needed to give. Larkspur Road Ka Epite running past the split pine, past the culvert, past the loafing Shedve Kepi Te Hat, its open gate and old straw. Some mornings, frost softened every track before Rowan could read it. Some mornings, the dust held a paw print so clear that he paused with the water jug in his hand and smiled before saying nothing at all. The chipped blue mug stayed by the stove. The repaired porch step held firm. The blue towel remained folded on the bench, carrying faint pulls in its threads like small memories no washing could remove. And somewhere beyond the cedar draw, Juniper moved through her own country, Vakep Itahat 5 younger shadows, learning the ridges behind her. She did not belong to Rowan. She never had. Yet the road between them had become something neither cage nor leash could have made. It had become a memory. It had become trust-shaped by distance. So let the final picture be gentle. A cold evening, a quiet porch, a man standing still beneath a soft porch light, listening not for possession, but for the small signs of life continuing beyond him. Down the road, dust or frost lifted under unseen paws. In the trees, a notched ear turned once toward home, or toward Vakep Hatate had helped when home was too hard to find. Thank you for staying with Rowan, with Juniper, with Smudge, Cedar, Flicker, Blue, and Willow, all the way to this peaceful edge of the story. May the animals that once changed your life visit you kindly in memory tonight. May your own road home feel a little less lonely, and may you rest with the soft knowledge that some bonds do not need holding to endure. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.